Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. I am joining you this evening from Dubai. And I can see we have people with us already. So we have good evening, Iraq, Qatar, and Georgia so far. And I'm sure there are other people there in the background as well. So good evening. This is our MENA Back to School 2021 webinar on advancing thinking skills. It's part of our Advancing Students Global Skills section of the Advancing Learning Program. And it's connected to a professional development module, which if you haven't seen, I will explain all about later on. Good evening, Saudi Arabia. So we have a lot of content to cover and not a lot of time. So I'm going to crack right on this evening. But first, I hope you're all well. If you've started back to school, I hope things are going well for you and your students. And if you haven't started back to school, I hope your last minute preparations are going well. Hopefully there is some food for thought in this webinar. And there will also be some practical stuff as well. So hopefully a nice balance between the two. If you're new to the group, if you haven't seen me, if you haven't been with the Macmillan family or the MENA PD Academy community recently, my name is Nathan Waller and I am the teacher trainer for Macmillan Education in MENA. So covering everything from Morocco to Oman, the guys up in Erbil there, down to the guys in Somalia, and everywhere in between. Okay, we're going to crack right into it. So today's session, I wanted to start with this quote because thinking skills helps us to make decisions. And we have a sea of decisions, an ocean of decisions that stretch out way ahead of us into the future. Hopefully there is a long and happy and healthy future for everybody here. And we have plenty of decisions to make. And our ability to think, our ability to think critically, but our ability to use other thinking skills affect that journey quite dramatically, I think. So we're going to look at why are thinking skills so important. We're going to have a little look at critical thinking. I don't think we can get away from it. But we're not going to do too much on critical thinking. We're just going to critique it a little bit. Ask a few questions of it, because I think that's important. We're going to look a lot at other forms of thinking and how they might influence what goes on in the learning environment. And of course, we want lots of skills and strategy developments. And hopefully there will be some tips along the way as well. Hopefully that sounds good. Hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you will be with us for the next 60 minutes. Let's get going. And of course, if you've been with me before, you know I usually like to start with some kind of interactive activity. And today is no different. I want to make sure all of those brain cells are firing on all cylinders. I want to make sure everybody's brains are working this evening. It's probably been a long day. You might have been teaching, you might have been preparing, you might have been at the beach, I'm not sure. But wherever you've been, hopefully you're not too sleepy and you can engage with the content here now. Okay, so I've got 4 questions. Let's see how good your critical thinking skills are. We expect a lot from our students, but how good are we? Question number 1. Hopefully you haven't seen these before. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Nice, easy one to start. Sleepy but excited. Good, Shakir. I'm glad you're in there. Come on. You're with us. So, question number 1. Not going to give you more than 30 seconds. Don't need to think too much about it. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? I'll give you a few seconds for some answers to come through. Ooh, that's hot. Shakir, coming in there. Yes, 10. Any advances on 10? More people drifting into the room as we're talking. We've started with a quiz. Question 1 is this. What is the answer? Nice, easy start to the evening. Anybody else? You might be on your phone, you might be on your laptop, I'm not sure. I'm going to count down from 10, see if any more answers come through, and then I will reveal. Don't want to spend too long. Is everybody frantically thinking? Okay, if you have been thinking about this and you haven't got your answer down on the chat box yet, no problem. The answer is 5 cents. Now, intuitively, we want to say that the bat costs $1 and the ball must cost 10 cents. But of course, the key word here is more. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So the ball costs 5 and the bat costs $1.05 because it's $1 more than the ball. In total, making $1.10. A little bit of a trick question there, or trickery in that question. Let's move on to the next one then. If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? See if we can get a few more answers in the chat box. Wakey, wakey, people. If it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long will it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? Don't overthink. Just, what do you feel like? Give you 30 seconds. Drink some tea. Hello from Doha. 25 minutes, okay. I can see where you're going with that thought process. Anyone else? Any more answers? Ten more seconds. Nice and easy in the chat box. Shakir, you're playing alone at the moment. Okay, the answer is 5 minutes. It's the same. So 5 machines are making 5 widgets in 5 minutes. So 100 machines will make 100 widgets also in 5 minutes. So we need to kind of compartmentalize there a little bit. Ah, yes, logic, good. Catching up. Okay, question number 3. Don't worry. Okay, we've got a lake. There is a patch of lily pads in our lake. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half of the lake? So 48 days for the entire lake. How long for half of the lake? Any guesses? 48 days. 48 days for the entire lake, but what about half the lake? We just need the answer for half. Yeah, see, sleepy but excited, you're catching up. 24, 48, 47, 24. Those brain cells are now clicking into action. 24. Okay, the answer. One person writing. Are they going to get it? I'm excited to find out. Oh, what are they going to say? Oh, they vanished again. The answer is 47 days. So 48 days for the entire lake. And of course, we're doubling every day. So we've got to work backwards. So the day before, it would be half the size, which would be half the lake. So this one, we need to logically think backwards. So the answer is 47 days. Okay, so a few questions there. Thinking about thinking, getting those brain cells working. The next question is not actually a question, it's just an image. And I want you as fast as possible to write down in the chat box, what can you see? So get those fingers at the ready. Are you ready? What do you see? First thing you see. Okay, everyone the same at the moment. Bird, a duck head, bird, a duck. Oh, yes, we got different. A rabbit. A duck, a rabbit, rabbit and a duck. Oh, you see both at the same time. Maybe one with each eye. That would be interesting. Okay, so just a fun way to start off the session. Just showing that A, thinking is not actually that easy, and B, that we tend to see things in different ways. Our brains are not all identical or individual. Okay, so our first point was, what is the point of working on thinking skills? Why do we need them? Why do we need to think about these in the English language classroom? Why can't we just teach them vocabulary, teach them grammar, work on those skills, do some listening and some reading and some writing, and send them on their way, happy, knowledgeable students, ready to succeed in the world beyond? Now, of course, that's the way things used to be, but not anymore. Now we have all of this work, this body of work on life skills, of which thinking and critical thinking are one of them. And I've got this quote here from Steve Taylor Knowles, who's the author of Macmillan's Open Mind. If you've ever seen any of his work, it's really good. And he's talking about competences. So not just knowledge, but being competent. And in different contexts as well. Not just academic. We don't just want academically gifted students, although that would be nice. We want them to be able to succeed in social and professional contexts as well. And for that, they need lots of transferable interpersonal skills, like critical thinking, communication, and as you can see from the infographic there, things like collaboration, being able to take control of your own learning, and interacting with technology and digital literacy, these kinds of things as well. So we want students that have not just knowledge and content, but skills beyond that to be successful. And we want to develop this 21st century learning, learner-centered, less teacher-centric, less sage on the stage, more interaction, students collaborating, students questioning, a focus on experiences. And as we've seen from the last year and a half, we need students to be adaptable as much as possible. There are going to be challenges for them in the future, challenges for them now, but really this has kind of highlighted this need for students to be adaptable once they leave education. And we've got this idea of creating content and recreating and co-creating content together, both in school, but beyond that, in their professional lives. They may not work for a company. They may do their own thing. They may be an entrepreneur. They may be one of these working nomads or whatever. They're still going to need these types of skills, probably, to be successful, unless they want to live by themselves on the mountain. And we're being told this all the time, whether it's big companies, whether it's educational associations, or whether it's kind of ed tech or educational leadership companies. We keep being told that students need problem-solving skills, critical thinking skills, creativity, these kinds of skills are always kind of coming up. And it's interesting for me to see. So I went back to 2014, so not that long ago, 7 years, and looked at the kinds of skills that employers were saying that they wanted from graduates. Now, critical thinking wasn't actually explicitly mentioned, although you could probably say some of these are kind of part and parcel of critical thinking. You move that 6 years later to 2020, and critical thinking is right there. Critical thinking, number 4, and analysis. And then we've got other aspects of it, analytical thinking. So even within a 6-year period, there's been a big shift in what employers feel is important. And I've got a funny feeling when we do this kind of survey again in 2022 or 2023, that some of these will probably change based on all the things that have happened. Okay, so that's kind of why. We know why. We know that it's important. We want our students to have it. Making it happen in an educational environment is something a little bit different, a little bit tricky. Now, critical thinking has been around for quite a while. So let's critique it a little bit, because I don't want to just kind of give you a definition and explain all of the steps. I want the challenge for me in this particular webinar was to make this presentation without putting Bloom's taxonomy into my presentation. And I think I've done it. Let's see. Okay, so maybe the sound is not that great. My connection is okay, and my microphone is up full, but I'll try and talk a little bit louder, and hopefully that will help. Okay, so 1 being I have no idea, 10 being I have a very clear idea. You can put yourself on this scale. Do you have a really clear idea about what the term critical thinking means? Some people will be perhaps very high. Shakir saying number 7, okay. Number 9, okay. Some people have got a very good grasp of what critical thinking is, which is great. Okay, good. And that's probably because there's been a lot of work on critical thinking. There's lots of webinars, you can see YouTube videos. There's a lot of things telling us what critical thinking actually is. But it is claimed to be one of these buzzwords. Everybody's using it. And it could mean different things to different people. So it's good to explore that a little bit. But more importantly, it's important to think about how we actually make it happen in the classroom. So if you go and do some classroom observations with a focus on critical thinking, lots of teachers will probably say, this was my critical thinking section. But whether or not students were practicing those types of skills and understand what they're practicing, sometimes doesn't always level out, I think. So very quickly, what skills or thought processes does critical thinking include? Should be a very easy for everyone, since they put 7s and 8s and 9s. What skills or thought processes does critical thinking include? You can write them in the chat box if you want, you don't need to. But perhaps a more important question is, can we rank them? Can we say what kinds of things are important? So we've got good, Nadia, analyzing, evaluating, discussing. We've got judgment, I think is what we're trying to avoid. Evaluation, good. But in terms of these types of skills or processes, which ones are more important than others? And again, you don't need to write this part in the chat box, but have a think about that to yourself. What aspects of critical thinking are more important than others? Because when we come up later in this webinar to look at some of the sub-skills, we'll see that teachers tend to place more emphasis on some than others. Here's a few. I'm sure we'll pick out some of the vocabulary. I'm not going to read them all to you, but we can see some of the types of things that people have put in the chat box. Analysis, evidence. We've got suspending judgment, which I think was very close. Logical, inquiry, problem solving. We've got inquiry, we've got reason, we've got reflection, justifying, good. Lots of these things. And when you get this PDF, you can have a look at these yourself. We don't want to spend too much time on this part. Yeah, rational thoughts, suspending judgments, problem solving, looking at things objectively. Now, I went right to the root of the thinkers on critical thinking, criticalthinking.org. And again, you can look this up. And I'm not going to read it. It's a very long-winded quote that you can pull off of their website. But what really struck out for me in this particular quote is in the middle. Critical thinking is self-directed, self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective thinking. All about the self. It's something that we choose to do. So we need to think about that in terms of how we approach it in teaching and learning, because it's unlike other aspects of teaching and learning. We cannot force our students to be critical thinkers. We can guide them, but that's as far as we can get. We need to basically show them that this is in their own self-interest, and hopefully they are motivated to take their own thinking forward. That's what we would like to see. And then use that for things like communication, problem solving, and also challenging our own assumptions all of the time. So this is what we're aiming for with students. And there are certain models. There are lots of things you can see much of this on the internet. Some people like this model, which is the RED model, recognizing assumptions, evaluating information, and drawing conclusions. So this kind of academic, rigorous research kind of model. Some people like to go with the kind of things like the question staircase. I'm almost to Bloom's taxonomy here, so I'm not sure. Maybe you give me a 50-50 on whether or not I got Bloom in there or not. But you've got this question staircase, and somebody mentioned there in the chat box, higher level thinking skills, these higher order skills, HOTs, pushing students up that ladder to higher order thinking skills, where they're analyzing and evaluating. And there are some things here which might be able to help you, different types of questions. Moving away from the kind of who, what, so, who can you see, what are they doing, these kind of closed questions, and moving into more open questions, getting students interacting with each other in a more conversational way. And we want to push students up to this higher order thinking as much as possible. Most people break down these HOTs into 4 different elements: application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. Now, they're very kind of scientific words. So what do they mean? Well, application is things like problem solving and experimenting. And if you think about that practically in the classroom, we can think about things like role plays or solving mysteries. Yeah, these kinds of activities. And students can make their own mysteries and set them for their peers as well. Don't feel like it's always got to be you that makes everything. Get them to create their own mystery, their own pathways to finding things out. And you can do that as group work or interactive activities in the classroom. Role play we tend to see a lot of in younger years. You go into a pre-primary classroom, you see tons of role play. Get the dress-up box out. Let's do lots of interactive play and role play. Role play for older students, teens, and young adults is more kind of formal role plays, more kind of presentational role plays. But they're still important, and they're still really good ways to apply higher order thinking skills, because it's not just regurgitating information in like a presentation. We've got analysis, so identifying patterns and organizing ideas. And again, we see a lot of this in the higher educational format of education. And we can think of things like guided discovery, inquiry-based learning fits into this very nicely. For synthesis, we've got prediction, we've got inferring or inference. And this is things like predicting the end of a story. So if we're doing a piece of reading with a bunch of students, can they predict the end? Can we stop partway? And can we put them into groups, and different groups come up with different endings? And then they discuss why they thought that ending would happen the way that they did. And they can ask questions of each other. Again, we're pushing them towards more open-ended questions. And the last one, evaluation, assessing, comparing, judging merit. And we've got lots of activities like debates, which are very good for this kind of thing. And the most critical one is self-reflection. We want students, as much as possible, to be engaging in self-reflection of their own progress, their own abilities, their own interests as well. So that's a little bit about higher order thinking skills. And we've got these sub-skills. So I asked that question, what comes within? And we've got a lot of sub-skills that quite often get skipped, or we kind of jump over them, or we avoid them because they're quite difficult. Things like reading between the lines and lateral thinking. not that easy. Weighing up positives and negatives, maybe if we're doing something like a debate, it's quite easy to fit that in. But in other areas or other activities, it can be a little bit more difficult to get some of these things in. But these things are just as important. And it often, when you speak to students who have left secondary or pre-foundational courses, and they go on to university courses, they could be very good in English. They can have a high level of English, know a lot. They can think that their English is very good. But they quite often come back and say, I'm struggling in university because there's a lot more going on. My language is okay, but I'm not able to do some of these other things when I engage in seminars or when I'm writing my essays. I'm still thinking too, I haven't got there yet, but I will. 2 seconds. And the last thing is to make it personalized, to personalize as much as possible the content, because again, that allows them to speak more freely, it gives them more to talk about, and also it allows them to, it allows you to keep those open-ended questions going further and further. If it's just rinse and repeat, then it's very difficult for them to keep that level of speech up. But if it's something personal, we find it easier to keep talking about it. I put an activity to help with personalization a little bit here, something called rotating stations. So let's say you've got a group of 24 students. You make 8 stations and you put them into groups of 4. Each one goes to a different station. And on each station is a different topic. Now, you can use anything. You could use IELTS prompts. They're very good. You can get them from the internet very easily, but it's something that gets them thinking about a particular topic. It challenges them. It could be anything like, do you think we have enough police? This kind of thing. So they have like a few minutes as a group to decide their answer. So they have to communicate, they have to collaborate, they have to negotiate their answer. They write it down on the piece of paper, and then they leave that there and they move on to the next station. And the idea is that it's personalized for them. They've got their thoughts down on paper, but they can see other people's points of view before they tackle it themselves. So other than the first station, where they don't have anything to read because they're the first team, everything else they're building up and they're seeing a variety of other people's answers. So they're not just coming into that question, that topic, completely blank. The group can discuss all of the other points of views first and see whether that changes their mind, because this is an important part about critical thinking, is that our ability to have our minds changed by new information. So that's a small activity that I just threw in there. And of course, we've been talking about higher order thinking skills, and we want to really focus on, when we get up there with these higher order thinking skills, we want to be thinking about metacognitive processes. We do a lot of cognitive work, for vocabulary, grammar, these kinds of things, but we want students to be able to think about their thinking, understand the processes of thinking that they are going through. And things like the quiz questions I put at the very beginning, help us to think about, oh, I thought this was my answer. Now, if I think about it and I break the question down, I can see why I thought wrong and how I could maybe think about that differently in the future. This kind of thing, metacognitive. And so we're moving away from memorizing, drilling, classifying. We do a lot of classifying in the English language classroom. And we do a lot of guessing meaning from context. If you think about grammar, we show them a piece of reading, we get them to deduct out the meaning to the form, this kind of thing. Moving into metacognitive strategies, hypothesizing, comparing things, reviewing things. And again, that self-assessment comes up. And again, I thought I would have an activity. So let's practice this one ourselves. We're thinking about working rules out for ourselves. So I've got 3 columns and 3 words: looked, played, and started. And I'm going to give you another word. And I want you to choose which column you want to put it in. So the first word is amazed. Would you like it in column 1, column 2, or column 3? You don't have a lot of information at the moment, so you can choose whatever you want. Shakir, straight in there. Number 1, number 2, number 1. Lots of people going in with number 1, number 3. Okay, number 1. Number 35. Ooh, not sure what number that is. You're way over here to the left. Okay, the next one. So amazed actually goes into column 2. Our next word is wanted. Which column are you going to put the word wanted in? Number 3. Number 3. Of course, this would be very easy. Shakir still wanted in number 1. He's just filling up column 1. Number 3. Good. So we are obviously all teachers and well-educated people, so we can work this out pretty easily. Shakir is going, just everything, number 1. Hey, Shakir, it's fine. Absolutely fine. You take that column. It's yours. I'll put your name in there. Okay, and then I could keep going. I could give you more and more words, and you would eventually start to figure out the rules. Nadia figured it out pretty quickly. Of course, there are different pronunciation for the ed at the end of words. We have a t sound, like looked, and we have a d sound, like played, and we have an id sound, like started. Yep. And you start to work them out. So we can give students new words and they can figure this out themselves. Teaching them a strategy. That's very simple. And it's very simple because it comes from a primary course. So we can introduce critical thinking. We can introduce these thinking strategies right from a very early age. It's not something we need to wait until they get to university. Okay, now we've got them to B1. We can start working on some thinking skills with them now. No, we can really get this in as early as possible. Teach them strategies, build upon those strategies, and then when they get to teens and young adults, they can use those strategies and we can push their outcomes higher and higher, hopefully, inshallah. So that was just something very simple. We could do other activities to work on that, to check that they understand what it is we're trying to get them to do. Okay, so thinking skills. How important is it within your job as an English language teacher? Are you just teachers of the knowledge of the language, or do you think critical thinking is an important part of what you're supposed to do in the classroom? Face-to-face or digital classroom? A 10, yeah, I think it is very important. Yeah, people are going to say 10. It would be really interesting to see whether or not I asked this same question 20 years ago, what people would say. I think it would be far down the other end of the scale, which is quite interesting that there's been this push for these kinds of skills, especially as most of us who were in education 20 years ago, a lot of us are professionals. A lot of us must have learned critical thinking somewhere else if it wasn't being done in school. Where was that? I'm not sure. But now it's definitely seen as something very important, certainly within terms of academic success. If we want students to be successful academic students, they need these critical thinking skills. And they need them for many reasons. One is that the world is very different than it was 20 years ago. Jobs certainly are very different, but we're overloaded with information. We're on our phones all the time. We're being bombarded with new information all the time. And assessing the validity of that information can be very, very difficult. Think about if you've seen a forwarded post on Facebook or LinkedIn. If you see it once, you're likely to be quite skeptical. But if you see it 10 times or 20 times over a long period of time, and if it comes from people that you trust, then you're more likely to start thinking, well, maybe actually this is the way maybe this is real, but it still might not be real. Yeah, we need to be continuously reflecting upon that. So we've got information overload, that's one thing. We've also got this idea of fake information. I put fake news there, but we've got unreal information being kind of thrown at us all the time. And deciphering what is real and what is fake is becoming increasingly difficult. This here talks about millennials and Gen Zers, where they get their news from. So news that comes from social media, if that's where you're getting most of your news, it's very difficult to keep track of whether or not that has been edited or whether that's just somebody's opinion that's being presented as fact. People agree with this? Would you say that this is one of the important aspects of critical thinking? information overload, fake news. Do you think these things are important? It will be interesting. People haven't written anything, but it'll be interesting whether or not you think yes, because I haven't put any sources on either of these two slides. Are these correct? Am I telling you the truth? Do 73% of young millennials get their information from, or their news from social media? When you saw that, did you just think, yeah, that's true? Or were you immediately thinking, where did he get that from? We also need to think critically as teachers all the time. Probably is true. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't, but fake news is everywhere. How good are you guys at fake news? I'm talking a lot about teachers needing critical thinking skills as well. Are you any good at fake news? I got a couple of examples for you. Real or fake? This guy in the UK had the Guinness World Records for the heaviest cat. Real or fake? It was a few years ago now. I think probably early 2000s. Real, fake, real, fake. Okay, so a mixture of opinions there. Very difficult to tell. And I wonder whether or not my description influenced whether you thought this picture was real or fake. I was telling you Guinness World Records. I was telling you, giving you information about dates. But it is, in fact, a fake picture. It's been photoshopped, and it's very easy to Photoshop, not just pictures, but we can manipulate videos and all sorts of things now. So it's very difficult to know whether what we see is real or whether it's fake. Another one, Beijing introduces a texting lane for millennials. So a little bit like at the bowling alley, it has two bumpers on either side of the lane. So if you're not paying attention, you don't drive off of the road, you just keep going in the same direction. Yeah, keeps you moving forward. Now, this is obviously a little bit more far-fetched. Real or fake? Yep, someone coming in with fake there. Of course, this is not a real thing. This is fake. But in the future, will it continue to be fake? I'm not sure. And one of the difficult things about newspapers is that if they put what seems like a fairly real-looking heading, we can often think, oh, actually, is this from a reputable source or not? I don't know. We question ourselves a little bit. But of course, that is not a thing yet. So there's a few things around critical thinking within the kind of learning environment. And this is a nice thing. I took it from Teach Thought. You can go to Teach Thought's website and find this very easily if you want to find it. But there's lots of things here which I thought were quite nice. You know, beliefs and stances change when new data emerges. It's inquiry-driven, not curriculum-driven, which is a challenge within schools because schools are very structured, very kind of unidirectional, very curriculum-driven. Critical thinking is actually a challenge to the systems and structures of education themselves. So there can be a bit of conflict there when it comes to critical thinking a little bit. And lots of other things as well. Questions are valued over answers, this kind of thing. Extending knowledge continuously. And you can find this, and you'll get this in the PDF as well. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to bring us down to the student themselves. This is a very difficult question to answer, but generally, let's kind of average it out. How would you rate your students' critical thinking skills? This is a bit of a leading question, to be honest, but it's an interesting one. And I've worked in HE for quite a long time, and I've heard lots and lots of different types of comments about how teachers view their own students' critical thinking skills. Yeah, 5s and 6s. Some could be a 10, yeah. Some a little less. There's going to be a mixture. Some young learners have 6s. Okay, good. So there's a range of numbers here. If you feel like your students' critical thinking skills are not as high as they perhaps could be, I don't want to say should be, could be is a better way, you will not be alone. So there's obviously lots of studies that have been done around critical thinking. So we have these guys, Mind Edge. Again, you can look them up on their website. In their second study, the second annual study, you know, they saw things like lots of people were getting pretty poor answers on critical thinking quizzes that they participated in. But that's not just the only thing. I think one of the most important things to come out of this is confidence. It's not just about whether we are good or not good. It's how do we feel about it? How do we feel about our own abilities in terms of critical thinking? And if I ask you this question, how confident are you guys in critical thinking? You might start to reflect on some of the questions that we've already done in this presentation. You might think to yourself, maybe I'm 12% as well. I'm not sure. But it's interesting, this idea is not just about ability, it's about confidence as well. And also, I thought it was quite interesting. This is not actually the second. I went to the website yesterday and I looked again, and they've actually got a third one that came out last year. So there's been an up-to-date study, and it was interesting that different generations perform when it comes to critical thinking. So what have we got here? We've got boomers outperforming millennials on digital literacy and critical thinking quiz. And digital literacy, you would think, wow, millennials would easily outperform boomers. Boomers is the generation after mine. I'm Generation X, I think. So baby boomers is before me. So you would think, oh my God, how is this possible? Critical thinking is difficult no matter what age we are. We always need to be continuously practicing this particular type of skill. Is it appropriate to do critical thinking activities with low-level students? And again, I don't need you to answer this one particularly, but I think there often is a confusion between language ability and thinking ability, especially in the second language classroom. Especially as students get older, we need to remember that just because they don't have the language to articulate what they want to say, doesn't mean they cannot do thinking type activities. And again, we could use L1 to do a thinking activity and then bring that back down to what it is we want them to do with the English language that we want them to focus on. So, but try not to get into that mindset of they cannot do thinking because they're low level, especially with younger learners. This happens a lot. They're very weak. People say they're very weak students, so I'm just going to drill them all the time until they learn it. We get stuck in this model of trying to kind of cram them with information because we feel like they're weak. Take a step back, think about it, and then maybe try to do other types of thinking activities, which are perhaps more engaging for them. And then maybe some of that language will come out, hopefully. Okay, so a little bit there around critical thinking. Critique, and I think it's important to critique critical thinking itself, but also Bloom's taxonomy as a model. It's very dominant as a model, but it's not the only way to think about critical thinking. And there's lots of ways that we can challenge our own critical thinking. Let's now move on to other forms of thinking, because I want to broaden this out and think about how we think more generally. The reason I want to do that is because we need to be able to distinguish. If we're only ever doing critical thinking, we're not focusing on these other thinking skills. And if we're doing all different types of thinking, how do we know that it's critical thinking that's taking place and not a different type of thinking? So it gets a bit confusing, I think. But we need to basically record and track our students' development, show them the progress that they're making so that they can not just see it, but understand it and understand what are the next steps so that they can want to get there themselves. We're talking a lot about language and thinking because obviously we're language teachers, and this is an interesting area around thinking. What comes first? This is a bit of a chicken and egg one, I think. What comes first, language or thinking? Now, people used to think that it was language determinism, that language determines what we think. Yeah, we're influenced by the environment. And they argued that because there are different languages around the world and people think differently because of those languages, that language must influence our thinking. Seems pretty logical, I guess. There's another body of thought that says, no, actually, it's unity of language and thinking. That actually thinking is soundless speech. So I'm talking to myself in my head using a language. But language itself is also thinking, but with sound. And we do that subconsciously, I guess. So there's this idea that it's actually the same thing. And then you've got thinking determinism, the other end of the spectrum. So although they've got a close relationship, they're not homologous, which means they don't come from the same origin. Thinking as a cognitive process is more important than language, that we learn to think first and then we learn a language afterwards. So they're kind of flipping that on their head. And you guys might have your own ideas about which you think it is. I think generally thinking determinism is the more popular nowadays, but you might want to go off and do some research by yourself on this. It's an interesting area of study, I think. Thinking determinism for sure, good. But we want to go, we're going to think more broadly. We're going to think about thinking itself. So we all know about critical thinking. We hear critical thinking in most things that we do. What other kinds of thinking are there? So I'm looking for other types of thinking. And I thought rather than give them to you, I'd elicit some from you. We've got one straight away, creative thinking, good. Any other? I've got 8 that I came up with. And again, depending on what you read or where you study, you could find a variety of these, I'm sure. Any other forms of thinking? Critical thinking 1, creative thinking another. What other types of thinking do you know? Objective thinking, okay. I think that might fall within critical thinking or analytical thinking, maybe. Analytical thinking, good. We've got 3 there so far. Any more? Lateral thinking, oh, I like that one, that's really nice. Classifying, I think, comes under another type of thinking. Under critical thinking, probably. Any more? Any types of thinking? Don't want to spend too long, so I'm going to flip them up. These are some that I came up with. We've got some that have been mentioned. Analytical thinking, this kind of rigorous scientific, research-based inquiry. Creative thinking, obviously we probably know a lot about that. We've got concrete thinking versus abstract thinking. It's really interesting when you see children grow up, how they move through the different phases of concrete thinking, abstract thinking, etc. Divergent thinking versus convergent thinking. Convergent thinking often comes into education a lot. There's a lot of people say that schooling is very much based on a convergent thinking model. You have 40 students with different ideas, and the job of the teacher is to channel all of those 40 into a single way of thinking so that they can pass their exams. Very much convergent, bringing everybody to a point. Divergent, the opposites. So yeah, more kind of problem solving based. How can we take one thing and go off in as many different directions as possible? And then you've got as well sequential and non-sequential thinking. We see sequential thinking in things like grammar. So you need to learn something in grammar before you can learn the next part. You need to learn the past simple before you can learn the past continuous or something like this. Yep, sequential, step by step. You cannot know one thing until you know what precedes it. These are just some of the things. But I think it's more important to think about the cultivation of thinking skills in our classrooms. We want to cultivate an environment, an atmosphere of thinking all the time, everything that we're doing with our students. Let's look at some of them. We've got this cultivation of analytical thinking, and we probably do this quite a lot in the language classroom, certainly at teen and higher education level. This idea of going below surface level, taking a deep dive, if you've ever deep dived into the internet and got lost researching about a particular topic. I do it all the time. But analytical thinking is not just question and answer, question and answer. Quite often there are more than one question to determine an answer. We've got to kind of go in and explore, pull things apart, look at cause and effect. Think that there might be multiple root causes, not just one thing that has an effect on another thing. Lots of analytical stuff. We do a lot of this stuff. It's all part of logical thinking. Creative thinking. There's, again, a lot of nice work on creative thinking. We probably could do a webinar all about creative thinking just by itself. But again, has anybody seen things like the TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson? There's a lot of criticism about schooling and creative thinking because of this convergent, structured model. Are we smothering students' creative thinking abilities? You don't need to answer. This is something for you to think about yourself. Some of these are questions just for you to kind of mull over. Is there an overemphasis on instrumental aspects of education? And do we neglect the humanistic aspect of schooling and education for our students themselves? I saw a study, this is not made up, talking about critical thinking, but I was reading a study the day before yesterday, and I think it was 85% of young learners, of students, said that they went to school, or they felt like they went to school for the purpose of relationships with peers. They studied, they did what they needed to do, they did the academic part because they had to. I'm being sent to school, I have to learn, I will learn, that's fine. You want me to do tests, I'll do tests. But actually, their purpose of going to school was to spend time with friends, was to interact with their peers, to build relationships. So this is this humanistic aspect of schooling. Do we neglect that a little bit sometimes? I'm not sure, probably different in different contexts. But there's definitely a lot of standardization in schools. Are we overemphasizing that? And what are we missing if we are? And again, this one, writing skills. We love to do writing practice, more writing practice, more writing practice. But actually, to be better writers, we need to be better observers. We need to use our imaginations. We need to use lots of other soft skills. It's not just about motor skills and copying what it is that we're asked to do from the book. Developing those writing skills comes from something richer, and reading fits into that a lot, I think. So this is a little bit about creative thinking, and we need to question our values. What are we valuing when we are in school, in education? Do we value knowledge over ability? Do we value external stimulation over internal stimulation? Is it very much teacher-driven? I need to get you through these exams, so this is the content. This is what I want you to do. You need to do this. This is your homework. Or is there opportunities for what students are interested in, what they like, what they find fun? Are there opportunities for them to be able to do these kinds of things? Do we value writing over speaking, which I just mentioned, and some of these other things, content over situation, stuff like this? And again, we can reflect on these ourselves and in our own classroom, but also within our school environment, because you are part of a bigger picture, a bigger body. Divergent thinking, again, if you watch Ken Robinson's TED Talk, he talks a lot about divergent thinking. And this idea, he uses this example of the paperclip. How many ways can you think of for using a paperclip? Very kind of simple. And you can do these kind of brainstorming activities with students. It doesn't have to be a paperclip, it could be anything. In his TED Talk, he argues that we get worse at this as we get older, that we're actually very good at it when we're 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, because we're not, I don't know what the word is, we're not beaten down, I guess, by education. That we are able to, we're not afraid of thinking outside of the box, breaking traditional thoughts and ideas and theories. And we see that in young children all the time. They ask these kind of crazy questions. I remember when I worked in preschool and reception in the UK, they'd ask all sorts of weird and wonderful questions. I remember making a journal once and writing them all down, and there's some amazing ones that used to come up. This idea of divergent thinking. Okay, so to end this part, I'd like to think about a couple of other forms of thinking that we don't really hear anything about. We don't tend to see these come up in discussions around education and thinking in general. But actually, they do form the basis, the basic level of thinking that we all are capable of and that we all do all the time. First one is intuitive thinking. We're all intuitive thinkers. But actually, learning and experiencing the world, going to work, going to school, tells us that we shouldn't be very intuitive, that there are right answers to things. But actually, we can learn a lot from our intuitive thought processes. Imagery is another one as well, and logical thinking we've already mentioned. So let's look at the first couple. Intuitive thinking to start with. So I've got an activity. I've got a couple of apples on the left, and I've got a picture of the moon on the right. And my question to you is, what's the relationship between these two objects, the apples and the moon? Give you a moment. What's the relationship between these two objects? Good. Similar to what people were saying this morning. Yep, circles, round shapes, the shape. They're both a circle. Good. Probably the shape. Good. Both of them are round. Okay, everybody's saying the same kind of thing. The key word in my question is relationship. What's the relationship between these two objects? Now, the similarity is that they're both round. Absolutely, I'm definitely not going to dispute that. But there's a relationship between them. They're definitely not from the same family. I don't fancy eating a moon. Anything else? What's the relationship between them? Because somebody super smart came up with a relationship between the two. Beautiful. Oh, that's a nice one. I like that. They're both special things. Good. It's a very difficult question to answer. So, I'm sure everybody has heard of Isaac Newton. Now, he obviously thought that, now why do apples fall to the ground rather than float off into the sky? And he also thought, when he was looking at the moon, why does the moon rotate around the world and not float off into space? This was intuitive thinking. It formed the basis of his inquiry. Now, obviously, he had to do scientific studies. He did a lot of work on this, but it all came from an intuitive thought in the first place. Something happened, and intuitively he thought these two things are related. So he found an internal relationship, an implicit relationship between two unrelated objects. And it's a very difficult thing to do, as we can see, because when we pitch that question, a lot of people come up with lots of different types of answers, like round. This morning, everybody was like, they're a circle. So it's a popular way. For most of us, if somebody showed me these pictures, I don't want to pretend to be as smart as Isaac Newton. I probably would have also said, they're probably the same shape. That's absolutely fine. So we have this intuitive thinking ability, but it's quite often very difficult for us to get it out. And we think, and part of this is because we think that intuitive thinking is a sixth sense. We think that it's something that sits outside of us. Yeah, it's a feeling. But actually, intuition is not a sixth sense at all. It's actually the interaction of all five of our senses and our subconscious, everything we've ever done in our lives, all coming together. Yeah. So it's unlike what we do in school, which is a lot of logical thinking, kind of linear, sequential, slow-paced, going in one timeline. Intuitive thinking is about pattern matching. It's about taking all the things that we know and experience and feel and coming up with a relationship there. So I think this is really interesting, this idea of intuitive thinking. The other one I mentioned was imagery thinking, and I've kind of given this one away, so I can't actually do an activity anymore. When I look at Google Maps, I can see Africa, and I can see South America, and I can see that they kind of fit together. Now, if we go back several hundred years, they didn't have satellites, they didn't even have planes, they couldn't look at the continents from above. They were massive, they mapped everything out, they were drawing maps. And at some point, somebody said, or somebody thought, they used their imagination and they said, maybe these two things used to be together. I can imagine these two continents being together. Now, of course, at the time, people probably laughed at them and said, that's utterly ridiculous. They're miles away from each other. How would that even be possible? But this imagery thinking, again, formed the basis of inquiry. And of course, they investigated I'm trying to think what it's called, the fault. What's the fault called? The one running down the middle of the Atlantic, whatever it's called. My mind has gone blank. And over time, we've studied plate tectonics, and we now know that the two plates were indeed probably at one point in time, not probably, they were stuck together and they've split over time and they're being gradually pulled apart. So this imagery thinking, that they had this ability to imagine what it might have looked like in a different time, and then base their inquiry processes on this, which again, I think is very interesting. Now, there are some others. I've mentioned two. If we go into something like logical thinking, I've got another activity that I want to do. This one I find really fascinating. Dialectical thinking. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but now we're moving away from psychology. So psychology, behavioral psychology, social psychology. I can't get the word out. Anyway, psychology plays a large role in educational systems. Again, a lot of dominance from educational psychology and how it influences us. Think about the kinds of academics that you know. Generally, they come from a psychology type of background. The Piagets, the Vygotskys, a lot of psychologists and behavioral psychologists. But now we're moving away from that. We're moving into thinking as being something philosophical. We're moving into the philosophy aspect of thinking. This idea that everything has two aspects rather than one, and that there's a unity in opposites. Now, if you're reading this, you're probably thinking to yourself, this sounds pretty confusing. I'm not really sure what this statement means. And that's fine, because I also don't really understand what this statement means. So we're going to look at this statement in a more visual way. So I've got an activity very quickly for you. Let's go back to 3rd century BCE China. We're going back a long, long time. Modern for 3rd century BCE China, but not modern in terms of where we are today. An emperor of probably a very small kingdom at the time was received an elephant as a gift, and he wanted to know the weight of the elephant. So he set his team a task. I want to know the weight of the elephant. So I'm going to put you guys in this team, and I want to know from you, how are you going to weigh this elephant in 3rd century BCE China? Now remember, this is a subsistence farming community, probably. I say emperor, but I'm pretty sure he didn't have the Forbidden Palace or anything like this. Very low tech. How are you going to weigh an elephant? People cannot pick him up. He's obviously too heavy for people to pick up. And we need to actually weigh him. We want a number. So how are you going to do it? How are you going to weigh this elephant? Maybe people coming up with some suggestions in the chat box. The team themselves, now of course they agonized over this, because I'm sure at the time the emperor probably hung a death threat over their heads as well. Come up with a weight, or that's it for you guys. Some of them said we need to make a scale. So they had scales in 3rd century BCE China, but scales were all manual. A person had to actually hold on their shoulders a bar, and then they would put like I don't know, rice in one side and corn in the other, and they would weigh them out. That was about as sophisticated as their scales were at the time. So someone suggested we could cut down a big tree, and then maybe we could try to make some kind of scale, and we could use the tree on one side and the elephant on the other. People said that's not going to work, because how are we going to lift the tree? If we can't lift the elephant, how are we supposed to lift a tree? It's the same. Number of people equivalent, okay? Again, figuring out how to make that happen is very difficult. Oh, good, look at this. So Nina, maybe you've seen this before. Okay, good. So someone came up with the bright idea. So why don't we put the elephant into a boat? Probably a bit bigger than the boat that I've chosen a picture for. But we'll put the elephant into a boat. The boat will obviously go down in the water. We will put a mark at the water level. We'll take the elephant out. And then we will use stones into the boat until it goes to the same level. And then we can weigh each stone separately. Yeah. And this is the foundations of dialectical thinking. It's being able to separate two things and break them down into their component parts and then build them back up. So obviously we cannot chop up the elephant to weigh him individually. So we need to use our thinking abilities. And this is where humans obviously differ from other animals, in the fact that we have this ability to be able to think abstractly about one thing. I want to achieve this, and I can do something else to achieve it in an indirect route, because there is a direct relationship between the two. And again, I really like this idea of dialectical thinking, and we can do some of these types of activities with our students as well. Last, in this part, I don't think we can forget or we cannot avoid this idea of emotional intelligence. Now, there's been a lot of discussion and there's some critique around the kind of concept of emotional intelligence. I don't really want to focus on that. I just want to think about it in relationship to thinking. Because if you're out and about, if you're out with friends, people say, do thinking and emotion contradict each other? Do they function independently? People say, when I'm really emotional, I'm not thinking straight. We have these types of phrases. How does that relate to what's going on within the language classroom, you might ask yourself? We need to remember that if we're asking our students to do something, that they cannot just like machines, just, okay, I'm going to do a critical thinking activity now. We need to take into account feelings, emotional states, who they are, where they've come from. All of these kinds of things influence their ability to interact with the activities that we want them to do. And again, we could push this further, and we can think about the relationship between critical thinking and social responsibility if we're thinking about feelings and emotional states. Yeah, how much does critical thinking affect our ability to be responsible and caring citizens? So that's all about other types of thinking skills. I hope that was kind of interesting. It's a real kind of gloss over of some of them. Maybe you've plucked a few things out and you can go and do a little bit more investigation by yourself, or you can see some of the stuff that we're doing as well. We cannot obviously forget skills and strategies. We do need to be focusing on some of these things. I already mentioned this one. Critical thinking can be introduced in those early years. Skills and strategies can be learned and practiced as early as possible. We really want that as much as possible. And they are in a lot of the Macmillan course books. For example, we looked at Global Stage before, and it's got lots of critical thinking types of activities, lots of think it over, planning, reflection. This stuff about mistakes, making mistakes, and reflecting upon them. Yeah, and this idea of looking back. I've got to the end of the unit. Let's look back. What did I do? What did I like? What did I enjoy? What did I not do very well? What would I have done differently next time? These kinds of things. And there's other things as well. We've got visual thinking routines, which we see a lot of in course books these days. The see, think, wonder, and think, pair, share, these kinds of activities. And we've got reading journals as well. So not just individual thinking activities, but actually doing things together. And this can be done at primary level, all of these types of things. You don't have to be using Global Stage. You can be using another course book and integrate those types of activities into your syllabus, your curriculum, your activities all of the time. And we can keep integrating critical thinking in all aspects of the syllabus. When I think about higher education, and I review higher education course books, very often critical thinking sits as like a slot. I remember seeing, I'm trying to think which foundation book it is. I think it's Q Skills. I think critical thinking is in the kind of the end of the writing section. It's like critical thinking for writing. And I think in Unlock, it used to be a bit before that. It was kind of something that was done in preparation for going on to productive skills. But actually, I think critical thinking needs to be integrated continuously throughout the unit, thinking about different ways of bringing thinking tasks into our unit progression all the time. And we'll look at some of them. Some of the things we do want to do as students, ideas development, developing those ideas continuously so that they can produce better speeches, better presentations, better pieces of writing, etc. And we can do that through critical discussions. So lots of idea development and discussion work throughout. And some examples. This one is from Open Mind, I think. And, there's whole pages now dedicated to kind of life skills. We've got a lot of evaluation stuff here. In the bottom corner, we've got reflection. And so there's loads of things going on, integrating those life skills, those thinking skills, continuously throughout the unit. That's just one example. And again, we've got this one, reflect. How can the skill of managing your time be useful to you in the work, career, and study and learning? So getting them to think when they're teens or foundation level, you're going to need these skills later on. Can you work on them now? How can you work on them now? And again, this one from skillful, explicit critical thinking. Again, we've got some of the things we've mentioned, applying information. There's another one on the next slide, comparing, contrasting, and this personalization one that I mentioned, relating to personal experience. And we want to lead them, we're scaffolding them all the time towards this idea of supporting an opinion and using the best language that they can. I really like skillful for the fact that every unit starts with an infographic. Infographics are really good ways to get students exploring thinking types of activities. This one is foundation, so it's actually very low level. So the questions that the book gives you might not be particularly higher order thinking skill types of questions, but you can adapt them yourself. What you can think, when you look at this now, what kinds of questions could you ask students to extend those discussion points? I think there's a few on here. Things like, do you think your diet is healthy? Why is your diet healthy? Talking about their personal experiences, restaurants that they know. Yeah. Evaluating sources of information, whether they're reliable. And you could bring it, even if they don't have that much experience, you can think about the school cafeteria or the college cafeteria. And then we're looking at pros and cons. So we've got those positives and negatives again coming in. In terms of reading, again, this is an example from skillful. We don't need to worry about the reading itself. But when we do academic readings, we tend to do the same kinds of things. We often see skimming and scanning. We can identify main points, noticing grammar structures. We tend to do comprehension questions with them. And we might ask them for their opinions, but quite often this might be as far as we go with a piece of reading. We're stuck for time. So I'm going to do the essentials, we'll do some skimming and scanning, we'll do some comprehension questions, and then we'll kind of move on to the next part of the unit. But actually, there's a lot of opportunities if we can slow down a little bit. Can we bring in counter arguments, contrasting points of view? The idea is that we want to not just get them to think about this particular piece of reading, but challenge them to go beyond what they think they know about the topic. Yeah. So look for opportunities as much as possible. Can you find other pieces of writing? And the nice thing about academic writing is you can find contrasting points of view, which have a lot of background justification. So it gives students a lot to think about. Now you probably have a ton of challenges. We haven't managed to get to most of them. Think about some of the problems you face as a language teacher when including critical thinking into your lessons. How do you solve these problems? Now, obviously, there's lots of ways you could do it. You could interact with your colleagues. You could come to the MENA PD Academy. Tell us about these types of problems that you face, and we will collate them, try and come up with collective answers. There's not an answer for everything, but we'll guide you as much as we possibly can. But I'm sure each and every one of you has numerous challenges when it comes to thinking skills. Okay, 5 more minutes before we finish. We just got a few tips. I'm going to kind of race through these because we've kind of gone over time a little bit. First one, give students time to think. It requires more processing time. Present a picture before you give them any words. Get them interacting with the picture, especially if pictures are juxtaposed. Really nice, 2 different points of view. Which do they agree with? They don't need necessarily a lot of language to engage with that. Number 2, we mentioned this one, asking open-ended questions. And you can, again, if you're teaching online, it's nice because you can record your lesson nice and easily. But go back and review one of your lessons just from a critical thinking point of view. How many open questions did you ask? How many closed questions did you ask? How many opportunities did you give them to extend on their answers? Go through and do some self-reflection on your classroom time and try and build in more open-ended questions. If you can do that, you can move to this next level, that if you want to get to the root of any problem, you need to ask 5 whys. This comes from a Japanese philosopher. So if you ask why and someone gives you an answer, you ask why that and then keep going. If you've asked 5, you're getting towards the root of the problem. And this is how we learn, certainly as we grow. So this is why very young children ask why. Parents find it frustrating that their children keep saying, why, mummy, why, daddy, why? but this is what they're doing. They're trying to get to the root of their thinking process. And this is how they're figuring out the world around them. Always get students working collaboratively as much as possible. And again, when I said give students time to think, maybe one of the most powerful things in terms of motivation is to pitch something to students, but don't actually give it to them. Almost give them like a teaser for the next lesson. Something like you just drop in, a seed for thought that they start to think about before they come to class. And then when you start the next class, you get them to work collaboratively straight away, rather than having to introduce something, again, very from a blank slate. And again, so projects, teamwork, group, problem-solving activities, all of these things help students to see different points of view, different perspectives. And again, there's lots of activities that we can do. You could give one picture. Let's just say we give a picture of a phone. Here's my phone. Just give them a picture of a phone, nothing else, and they've got to make a short story out of that one picture. But they've got to do it in groups. One student is responsible for the beginning, one is responsible for the middle, one is responsible for the end. And again, you've got lots of collaborative work in there. They've got to negotiate, they've got to collaborate, they've got to communicate, they've got to make sure that there's synthesis throughout the story, that it all makes sense. And then they can present that and come up with different types of things. And again, more opportunities for discussion there too. Play devil's advocate. Super simple, but always a nice tip when it comes to thinking. Always challenge them. And again, you don't have to tell them that it's not your point of view until afterwards, but you can say, well, I think this. And then they argue with you. And again, those language skills can really come out because they can get quite passionate about it. And then you can say, I was only playing devil's advocate. I actually think the same way as that. But it's really interesting to make sure and get you to articulate why it is you think that way. And all of that is about encouraging students to ask questions. We want students to be asking questions. Students asking questions are engaged students, are motivated students, are students that are thinking and engaging with your content. So if you are finding that you're asking all the questions, you need to try and flip that psychology around within the classroom as much as possible. Getting towards the end, we already mentioned this one, this kind of metacognition. Don't be afraid to talk to students about their thinking skills development. Show them, make it visual. We talked about VTRs, make it explicit, show them their progress. That, again, is very motivating for students. And the last one, we need to practice what we preach. We talked a lot about teachers also needing to work on their critical thinking skills. That's not an accusation to anyone in the room, of course. I'm sure you guys are perfect. But we can always improve ourselves, and we can model that to students. Again, fits into that idea of mistakes, showing students that it's okay to make mistakes. Also, we can say, I'm not always that good at critical thinking. I saw something the other day and I took it at face value, and this was the consequence of that action. Things like this. Practice what we preach. So we mentioned these. Practice those soft skills, build up over time to higher order thinking skills, and make it visible and explicit. In summary, probably mentioned most of these things. Remember, we are not teaching them facts. We're training them, coaching them to think for themselves so that they can be confident and competent communicators, collaborators, global citizens, whatever you want to say. And remember, it's a process. It requires practice, which is why I like this little seed at the bottom that grows. Yeah. So we plant the seed in the early years, and then we can grow it over time. Yeah. And we can master those skills. We know it's important. Don't forget other thinking skills, scaffold it. The books will help you to do that as much as possible. Skillful is fantastic at scaffolding critical thinking throughout the unit. And then when they get to that piece of writing at the end, you can see all of those thought processes coming out in their work. But support students in it. Don't think that they can just get it by themselves, because they can't. The last one, teachers need support and training. That's where we come in. Obviously, it's great that you're here with this webinar, but we also have the module related to this webinar as well, which I will put at the top. If anybody's got any questions while I'm doing this, you can put them in the chat box. I hope it gave you a lot of food for thought around challenging what we think about thinking, which is an interesting phrase. And hopefully there were some practical things in there that you can do with your students. You can use some of those activities, you can adapt some of them. There was definitely a lot in there I'm sure you can find very useful. I'm going to put at the top. So if you look at the very top, there's a banner, green, with a little button, register here. This webinar is part of our professional development module around advancing thinking skills. So there's some readings on there. There's a few blog articles. There's a couple of academic journal articles around thinking skills. So there's them for you to read. There's a reflective survey on there, so you can challenge yourself. You know, what do you think about teaching critical thinking? This was part of the input. So as of tomorrow, we're going to be moving on to the practical side. So, you know, how can we integrate some of those other types of thinking into our classroom activities in a more practical way? It's great to come to a webinar, I think, and get some ideas, but we want to be doing some things in practice in the classroom. So this module is all about moving from this webinar on to the next stage, using some of this stuff in class and having our support. So we give you feedback on the activities that you choose to do, which is nice for you, hopefully. If anybody has any questions, you can always put them in the chat box. You can email me. There's my email address at the bottom. I hope you found today's webinar interesting. You will. Probably, you might get it at the end of this week, but probably early next week, I will email each of you individually with your named certificates of being here at the webinar, no problem. And I will send the PDF with that as well as the recording, which we will put on YouTube. That is the end. Don't forget, we have the new website. It's still being kind of updated continuously. I will put this recording into the website itself, but there's other things as well. We've got an ELT time, which is our like coffee break podcast next week on Wednesday. And we're going to be looking a little bit more about this actually. Skills for the Future is the title next week. So if you've got half an hour on Wednesday, do join us for a coffee. The back to school schedule is on the website as well, and you can register through there. We are back on Thursday, the day after tomorrow. We have Joanne Mitten joining us to talk about assessing project work, which is going to be really interesting. I think I'm looking forward to this one. Project work is another module that we've got going on. So it's going to be interesting to see this idea of evaluating and assessing projects, especially online. I think that's a very difficult thing to do. So we're going to be exploring that. And of course, we've got the PD modules, the one at the top, which you can register for now, which is live, but we have self-study modules on there as well. One around inclusion and one around literacy. And we will, again, be updating them continuously. So join the website. It's free. It's very easy. And from me, that is everything for this evening. I do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for spending an hour and 20 minutes. We went over a little bit today, but I hope that was okay, and I hope you found it interesting. I look forward to seeing you all again soon. Back to school is coming to an end, but I do have some more sessions, and we will see you again very soon. From me, good evening, and all the best to you and your students with the back to school that you are going through. Okay, thanks very much, and good night, everybody.